Welcome back to Explain 12. This video isn't actually about Explain 12 specifically, although it does feature the Laminar Cessna 172 with SimCoder's Reality Expansion Pack, which is something I'll probably talk about as we go along. It's really about the red-headed stepchild of flight simulation, which is trim. We talk a lot about sticks, about head tracking, about throttle quadrants, about panels in general, but we very rarely, if ever, talk about trim, specifically trim hardware. Now, to put that into some sort of context, why is trim important? And it's as important when flying an F-16 as it is when flying a GA aircraft like the Cessna 172. Two obvious examples: when taking off in a GA aircraft, or when approaching a landing in an F-16, we use trim. We use trim to control airspeed. So, for example, taking off with a Cessna 172, we'd look to put the top of the engine cowling on the horizon to generate an airspeed, a best rate of climb airspeed of 79 knots. While approaching in an F-16, we will use the pitch of the aircraft to maintain airspeed while we control the rate of descent, the vertical speed, with power. Now, you can do that simply holding onto the stick, but it makes things a lot easier if you trim the aircraft to fly at that specific airspeed. You also run into the issue, for example, when flying the base and final leg with the Cessna 172, that yes, you may be holding, let's say you're holding 65 knots. If you're doing that purely with backstick pressure, if you become distracted, you're lining the aircraft up, you're turning in, you're lining the aircraft up, you're looking at the PAPIs, it's very easy to then look at your airspeed and realize, actually, I'm at 60 knots or 70 knots. It's very easy to just relax a little bit of that backstick pressure to the point where you've moved away from the desired airspeed. And that's where trim comes into play. Now, the problem that we have with trim is that in the real aircraft, let's use the Cessna 172 as an example. You're holding on to the yoke with one hand while adjusting trim with the other. And in a real aircraft, you have tactile feedback, so that as you're adjusting trim, you can feel that in your left hand. Well, of course, unless you're using a force feedback controller, you don't have that tactile feedback in a simulated aircraft. Now, yes, you can buy, for example, you can buy the Brunner yoke, which is a force feedback yoke. The problem there, of course, is that it's quite expensive. It's about $1,000, and not everyone has that sort of disposable income. So most people, when using trim in flight simulation, are not getting that tactile feedback. As a consequence of that, what you wind up doing is you'll add some trim, release the stick a little bit, actually no, that's not enough trim, reapply, add a little bit more trim, and you keep repeating that until the thing stabilizes. Now, personally, I started out with a Microsoft Sidewinder force feedback stick, and I got that for Blackshark, for DCS Blackshark, but I could never get the force feedback with that stick to actually do what I needed it to do. Same is true with general aviation aircraft. I then moved to the Thrustmaster Warthog, which is, when you're looking at military flight sims, a lot of people will be using the Thrustmaster Warthog stick. Now, the problem with that stick, of course, is that it isn't force feedback, and of course also it has a pretty poor base. And for the purposes of this discussion, for want of a better word, when I refer to the joystick, I'm going to break it down into two parts: the grip and the base. The grip is what you hold, the base is what the grip goes into. Now with the Warthog, it has very strong centering tendency, so if you pull the stick the whole way back and release it, it will rebound back to center. It's a very clunky center. I also find with the stick, when I'm pushing it forward or pulling it back, when I'm adjusting pitch, if I hold, for example, if I'm pulling back on the stick, if I pull a certain amount of pitch and then want to add more, it's like I'm having to pull through an invisible barrier. It's not a massive issue, but you genuinely feel it, and that's going to affect how you control the aircraft. And you're really stuck with that the stick is what it is. Recently I bought a Virpil Warbird D base, and the great thing about that is that it is very adjustable, so you can change the cams, you can change the springs, you can also change the tension on the grip itself. And by the way, I'm reusing my Thrustmaster Warthog grip with the Virpil base, which is a great way to economize. What that means, right now I'm using the stock cams and the stock springs, but you can even change this, take the springs out completely, or just change the cams, change the springs, whatever you want to do. It's very customizable. But you can also change the tension of the grip, so that I have it set so that when I pull the grip back a little bit, it stays in that position, it doesn't move. Now if I pull it the whole way back, it's going to push back forward a little bit, but in practical use, when I'm taking off, for example in the Cessna 172, I can much more easily put the top of the engine cowling on the horizon, and then just make slight adjustments as required. I don't have to hold it there, I don't have to physically hold it there. I don't have to go through the process of trimming the aircraft, releasing pressure, adding trim, releasing. I don't need to do that. It's a much easier and streamlined process. Similarly, when I'm flying an approach, I can control the airspeed much better, because once I have the grip where I want it in terms of airspeed, it's going to stay there. Now you may say, well, that's not realistic, and that's true. In the real aircraft, you are using the trim wheel, but again, because you don't have tactile feedback through the stick or the yoke while trimming the aircraft in general usage in flight simulation, that's also not realistic. So it gets around having to use a trim wheel, but the trim wheel is not entirely realistic in flight simulation, again, unless you're using force feedback equipment. So that is definitely an option. Now Winwing and VKB do the same thing. I think in their units you have to physically open up the unit in order to change tension, whereas with the Virpil you just need an Allen key, and you can actually change both pitch and roll independently. So it's a much more convenient way of doing things. But either way, it's something to consider. I think we don't put enough emphasis on trim and the importance of trim, and I think certainly if you're starting out with flight simulation, it's something that you can overlook. There are better solutions than trying to kind of manhandle the trim in a tactile feedback less environment. So it's certainly something to consider. Now looking a little bit wider than that, because we are in X-Plane 12, we are in the Laminar Cessna 172, and we are using the Reality expansion pack. I would recommend it. I've used Reality expansion packs before. I always had the issue with them that I always felt that they really work best if you started and stopped on the ground. If you started mid-air, for example, I was using Rep while practicing landings. So I would start in the air, like 2 miles out or whatever it was, and it tended to confuse the rep, I think, a little bit. But as long as you are starting and stopping your flights on the ground, I would highly recommend it. Adds a lot more detail. The stock 172, I found on approach it was easier to control vertical speed. It's a little bit more difficult with the rep version. You have to use your stick as well as the vertical, as well as power, because otherwise it tends to hunt quite a bit, and I think you really need to stay on top of that and control it. Other than that, I'd highly recommend the rep. It really transforms the Cessna 172, and it's just, you know, Cessna 172 is a great aircraft to fly. It's slow, but that in itself is not a big negative. Certainly if you're learning to fly in flight simulators like the Cessna 172, as in the real world, it's a great aircraft. Because it's slow, it gives you more time to look at things and to consider what you should be doing, and just to be able to look at the instruments in an unhurried way, let me put it like that. So highly recommend it. Also, in the last video I looked at views. You can set the same views up in X-Plane 12 as you can in Microsoft Flight Simulator. I just have an issue with the left view because it's a high wing aircraft. I still haven't quite got it right, but you may see it as we turn on base and final. It's really difficult to look out the left window, but you know, with a high wing aircraft that's probably going to be the case anyway. It's certainly, in my opinion, I wouldn't use. I've used Track IR for maybe 20 years. I've used it for a very long time. Haven't used it for quite a while. It's a bit of a pain to use for me, I think, really. And I've heard people say it's kind of like a poor man's virtual reality, using head tracking or eye tracking. Yeah, I kind of get that, but I think the appeal of that, or the novelty of that, wears out quite quickly. Personally, even in the F-16, I will use keys to get views rather than looking around. I think if you're dealing with air-to-air combat, that's a different thing, whether that's in a jet or whether that's in a propeller aircraft. I think then it comes into its own, but in general usage, I don't use head tracking anymore. Okay, so getting back to the Cessna 172, as we're flying it now, I'm still getting the hang of, or getting back into the Cessna 172, so I'm getting it. If you look at the final approach, I'm a little bit low on final. I just almost land on the numbers, but I'm a little bit low, and I think that's really because I'm having issues kind of judging the point to turn in from the downwind leg. I'm just experimenting with different things, with different airspeeds, etc. So you see the vertical speed is kind of a little bit erratic, much more so than with stock. With stock, I seem to be able to just place it on 500 FPM, and it just pretty much stays there. See, that's not too bad actually, that view to the left. But as you kind of turn into final, that wing really gets in the way, really kind of blocks everything out. Much easier to do this sort of stuff with a low wing aircraft. And of course my coordinator turns are terrible, absolutely abysmal. That's something that again I'm looking to practice in this aircraft. Inputting that left rudder for the left turns, as well as banking. So I'm turning in a little bit early, and that again, you know, when you're flying a slower aircraft, you're turning in a lot later than you think you need to. But it's just a case of, you know, slackening off the turn. The issue though when you do that is that you have something else to think about. Whereas if you're turning in correctly and lining up dead center, it's one less thing to think about. So then you can concentrate more time on your vertical speed. So I'm just dropping a little bit low here. I start to add power just to bring it up a little bit. See, just a little bit too low. I always find that the PAP is a little bit hard to read. If you get two whites, two reds, if you get that contrast, then it's a lot easier to spot it. But without that contrast, I just find it a little bit more difficult. But you know, coming into land here, I've got that little bit of backstick pressure. You can see it with the yoke. For whatever reason, when I'm flaring the aircraft, I can't get the nose up properly. I don't know what the reason for that is. I need to do some more experimentation. But to properly flare, I need to really raise the nose wheel significantly more than I'm doing in this landing. But I can't for the life of me figure out why I can't get the nose any higher than I'm getting at the moment. I'm applying a lot of backstick pressure, but I just can't get the nose to rise up correctly. The rep will warn you when your RPM is lower than 900. I just find it does it a little bit too often. I don't know, I'm going to have to turn that off because it is a little bit irritating. It does pay. It's the same with the Piper Comanche on MSFS, the A2A aircraft. You do have to pay attention to things like your magnetos, so you do have to go through the tests. As I say, it generally makes the aircraft more realistic, and I would recommend the rep, especially when it's on sale. So those are my thoughts on trim. Just to recap, certainly if you're using a Thrustmaster Warthog with the stock base, I would highly recommend you replace that. It is a terrible base. The Virpil's a good option because you can reuse the grip, so you can save yourself a little bit of money on that. It's also a really good base for adjusting tension. With that done, you then have better control, in my opinion, on trim and on airspeed. So something worth considering. Views, set the views up how you like, whatever your stick is, whatever your yoke, whatever. You don't need to invest in head tracking, for example. You can get around that. Certainly, if all I was doing was flying GA aircraft in MSFS or X-plane, I wouldn't even consider head tracking. It's just not necessary, and it has its own issues, as any long-time user of head tracking, for example, will tell you. That has its own issues. Having to reset the view periodically, having to be very aware of sunlight. These things have their own issues. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you got something from it. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments section below. And as always, feel free to like, comment and subscribe.